You may have heard about how study after study finds that people with lots of wealth, which in our society, of course, means lots of power, are less compassionate and more narcissistic on average than others. Occasionally, this kind of research makes the rounds. We hear about how wealthy people spend longer checking themselves out in mirrors, or more often see life as a movie starring them, or don't respond with normal levels of emotion to other people's suffering. This is disturbing enough on its own, but have you ever thought that one of the reasons the wealthy and powerful are so emotionally disconnected from what's happening around them is simply because they don't understand what's happening around them? Researchers have found, for instance, a negative relationship between social class and the ability to correctly interpret facial expressions. Similar findings have been made specifically measuring power as opposed to wealth. This effect starts pretty low in the social hierarchy, with college graduates less accurately interpreting others' emotions than high school graduates. This isn't because of college itself, but because of the higher average earnings that come with a college degree, which makes you think that higher up in the hierarchy of wealth and power, you'd find some pretty utterly uncomprehending morons. It makes a lot of sense. You really don't need to understand what other people are experiencing if you have power over them. You never have to convince someone of anything if you can always just use coercion to get them to do what you want. Even children who socially dominate their peers, whether with physical aggression or purely social schoolyard cruelty, are less developed in what scientists call theory of mind, which, like it sounds, just means how well a person understands what other people are thinking. In fact, even in many other species, dominant animals exhibit less social skill and comprehension than those they dominate. All this is to say, there seems to be a pretty strong relationship between coercion and stupidity, between the kind of power that runs our lives and not having any idea what's going on. But isn't it strange, then, that we so often hear the opposite? We're told that the reason some people spend their lives stumbling between their private jets and their luxury hotels, while the rest of us toil in misery for them, is because of how uniquely smart and capable they are. We're told they're the ones who know how to get things done, the ones who've got what it takes to make the hard decisions and go the extra mile. We're told, in the truly unhinged words of Ayn Rand, that they're the ones who hold the world up on their shoulders, like Atlas in Greek mythology. Really, that's why she wrote a book called Atlas Shrugged. In this story, the rich and powerful are rich and powerful because they possess a rare kind of competence the rest of us can't even really begin to imagine. And they're just generous enough to run the world for the rest of us, because without them, not only would we fail to achieve the heights of human potential, not only would we lack for, say, smartphones and co-working spaces and Mission Impossible 5 Rogue Nation, but we'd probably also have trouble figuring out things like food and shelter. If this is true, if the kind of people who end up with power in the kind of society we live in are producing the best possible outcomes, history without them would be grim indeed, because with these kind of people running our lives, things haven't exactly been going great. In fact, hierarchical mass societies like ours, throughout history and prehistory, have an awfully reliable tendency to just utterly collapse. The world is absolutely full of the ruins of what were once vast cities, and they're often surrounded by barren deserts. Of course, no one ever saw a place like where the ruins of Babylon or Jericho currently sit and said, "This would be a great place to try to pull off survival at unprecedented population densities." These ruined cities are surrounded by what were once the hyper-abundant lands that sustained them. In fact, think of these elements, which we so reliably associate with archaeological sites. Ruined cities surrounded by lifeless wastelands, and giant stone carvings of the faces of the guys who led their civilizations into chaos and ruin. Now, think about the reliable characteristics of power in the world we live in today. The utter lack of concern with the ecological crisis, and that aforementioned tendency to check oneself out in the mirror. Doesn't all this make a lot more sense if the powerful are powerful, not because they're uniquely skilled or competent or otherwise qualified, but simply because they're uniquely obsessed with themselves and their own power? And wouldn't it make a lot more sense if this obsessive, self-aggrandizing seeking of personal power resulted in a fundamental lack of awareness about, well, really anything else at all? This is very different than simply saying that the powerful are evil. The important distinction is that while you might expect an evil person to starve some children or drop some bombs on a wedding or two, you wouldn't expect them to perpetuate truly global destruction, which would of course undermine their own narrow self-interest. But you would expect an oblivious person to do something like that. History is full of examples of a society's rulers utterly ignoring or actively perpetuating a threat to their own interests. For instance, when Tsar Nicholas II lost control of Russia in 1917, multiple accounts of his breezy, distracted responses to his advisors' terrified warnings strongly indicate that he simply didn't understand what was happening. He literally continued to obsess over upcoming social events and how many buttons should be on his officers' military uniforms as his empire collapsed. He didn't care that the vast majority of that empire's population were essentially slaves to a tiny class of landowners, or that people were tortured in his prisons for reading books, but he definitely did care that he was about to abdicate the throne and then, a few months later, get shot. Likewise, as former U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara perpetuated the atrocity and absurdity of the Vietnam War, he consistently failed to understand it. He spent years proclaiming that victory was near, producing elaborate mathematical formulae to justify his claim. He was consistently wrong, repeatedly making false predictions, because he simply never understood why the people of Vietnam were fighting, and what, for them, was at stake. In other words, he never asked himself, what would I do if someone invaded my home? Even though people called him things like a human IBM machine, he was utterly uncomprehending of the reality he thought he was measuring with his ostentatiously technical worldview. It's easy to understand McNamara wasn't a good person, but it's important to also understand that he wasn't, in any functional way, smart. He may not have cared about perpetuating mass murder, but he did care about the defeat of the United States. One can speak in terms of confidence intervals and linear regressions and still be an idiot. And now, flames reach to heaven and the oceans rage, while those with power babble about the war on Christmas and what people said recently on Twitter. Human societies are on a path of intensifying hierarchy, and a dangerous rift has emerged. Those who have power do not have the ability to understand the world, while those who understand the world are not able to exercise power. Unless we change this, unless we find ways of being that do not give power to a very particular kind of person who is very narrowly obsessed with that very power at the expense of really thinking about much else, we will be destroyed. And it will be a very, very stupid way to die.